So there's a domain of categorization that has to do with the meaning of things. Now, most of what the psychologists have dealt with, who are clinical psychologists, is actually the domain of categorization that has to do with the meaning of things. And it's actually because, as far as you're concerned in your life as a human being, you live inside a network of meanings of things, right? So for example, when you look at your mother, you're not looking at her as an object and then attributing all sorts of meanings to her. You see the meaning of your mother right away, and that meaning is multidimensional. It has a very long history, and it affects you directly at a physiological level. Maybe you hate her, and so the sight of your mother makes your heart race and your brain produce cortisol because she's categorized as unpredictable and chronic threat. That's a standard Freudian situation, right? Yeah. No one would laugh if there wasn't sometimes that was true. So, those are Freudian slips, by the way. When you discuss something like that and people laugh, then that's an admission on their part, like a deeply unconscious admission on their part, that there is truth to the statement, and it's also a truth that is somewhat painful to admit. So you can tell that. You can tell that when you're listening to comedians. They do that all the time, right? They tell you something that's absolutely, brutally evident that no one will admit, and everyone laughs. And that is a Freudian slip, technically, because Freud often listened to the sorts of things that would make his patients laugh, or make an audience that he was speaking to laugh, because that would give him some insights into what they were repressing, so to speak, and what they would allow to come to light. So, and jokes are often about things that are taboo, right? I mean, it's hard to make a joke about something that isn't taboo. So, All right, so I've kind of made a classification structure of these two different ways of looking at things. There's a meaning-centered way of looking at things, and the meaning is then the implication of the thing for action on your part. And there's a more materialistic-centered thing, which is sort of like the world as it exists if you weren't here, right? That's the fundamental hypothesis of science, is that there's something around that would be here and look the way it does look now if none of you were around. And, it's possible that that's true. And it's also possible that it's possible that it's true, it's possible that it's not true, but most possible is the fact that it's true in a way that we really don't understand, because the existence of things, the way we perceive them, is clearly dependent on our existence as a perceiver. And so what the nature of the world would be if there was no one around at all to perceive it, if there was no such thing as consciousness, that is a completely unsolved problem. So maybe it would be like a field of quantum potential or something like that. But it isn't even possible to really understand what that means. So now, having established that, I'll give you another example of it before we move on. So I said, for example, that when you interact with objects around you, you're not really interacting with objects. It's more like you're interacting with tools. Because your primary concern is, well, what's the world in relationship to me? What do I have to avoid, if I want to get to where I'm going? And what can I use to further my pursuits? And so you're like that deeply. That's why human beings are tool-using creatures, right? We have hands, and they manipulate the world. And those hands they're built into our cognitive architecture. Like, it's not like our brain is separate from our hands. It's very opposite to that. We wouldn't have the brains we have if we didn't have the hands we have. That's why things like octopuses, by the way, or octopi are very intelligent. They are, even though they're invertebrates. They only live a couple of years, so they can't learn that much. But they're extraordinarily intelligent, and it's partly because they're tentacled, and because they're tentacled, they can grab things and manipulate them. And so, they've developed an intelligence that's identifiable to us because we have little tentacles on the ends of our hands, and we're using them to fiddle around with the world all the time. So, now, there's the perceptual reality, which is that we know about already, that when you look at something and we track the way that you're interacting with, we know that one of the first things that happens is the relationship between the perceived object and your body is established very rapidly, okay? Because you want to map the object onto your body so you know what the hell to do, how to orient yourself so that you're safe and productive at the same time. There's a guy named J.J. Gibson, who was a psychologist of perception who operated in the late 70s. And people thought his theories they weren't behavioral, that's for sure. They were of a different classification or category. And Gibson also made the first sort of claim that what you saw in the world were things like tools. He called them affordances. And so, for example, when you approach what you would call from an objective perspective a cliff, Gibson would say, you don't see a cliff, you see a falling off place. And you might infer cliff, but you see falling off place. And if you think about it, again, from a Darwinian perspective, of course you see falling off place. That's why, you might shrink from a precipice, as your whole being perceives that as a place that would instantly make you extinct. It's not a secondary derivation from your analysis of a set of objective facts. It's a primary perception. And it has to be, because you better move quick if you're too near a cliff. You don't have any time to think. And the same thing occurs when maybe you're being, potentially struck by a snake. You have circuits in your brain that will see that snake and make you jump way before you know it's a snake. Because standing around waiting for the image of snake to form in your consciousness means that you've been bitten 5 or 6 times already, because you're just not fast enough to see and then move. You see, move, and then perceive. And that's what keeps you safe. And so a lot of what you perceive in the world are the meanings that you map onto your body.